orchestrated original revenge memoir with fresh characters, realistic financial fraud plot, and audience-responsive narrative structure. Orchestrated original revenge memoir with fresh characters, realistic financial fraud plot, and audience-responsive narrative structure. The smoke detector in my kitchen had been chirping for 2 days, that low battery whine that gets into your teeth, and when I finally dragged the stepladder over and popped the cover off, there was a second device sitting behind the real one. Smaller. A little black square with a pinhole lens, and the lens was pointed down and to the left, straight at the end of the table where I sit every first of the month to write out my checks and balance my book. The adhesive was still tacky. The thing was still warm. And my son-in-law had told me to my face 10 days earlier that he'd already changed that battery for me. I left it right where it was. I want you to understand that because it's the only reason I'm sitting here today instead of in a county home with a stranger signing my name. I didn't yank it down. I didn't holler. I stood on that ladder at 67 years old with my knees aching, and I made myself breathe. And then I climbed down slow and put the kettle on like nothing in the world had changed. Before I take you through what came next, and some of it is hard for me to say out loud even now, do me one favor. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what the hour is where you are. A man told me once that a story only matters if it reaches somebody. I want to see how far this one travels. My name's Glenn. I spent 41 years putting in furnaces and air handlers and fixing other people's heat in the dead of New Hampshire winters, and I retired 6 years back to a little place outside Conway with 11 acres, a barn I don't really need, and a view of the mountains my wife Ruth picked out before the cancer took her. House is paid off, has been for years. I tell you that not to brag, Lord knows it isn't much, but because that paid-off house turned out to be the whole reason for everything, and you'll want to keep it in mind. I'm a careful man by trade. You don't run gas line for 4 decades by guessing. So when I climbed down from that ladder, my mind started doing what it always does with a problem. Who had been in this house? Who had reason? In the last 3 weeks, only 3 people had set foot past my mudroom. There was Gus, my neighbor up the road, 79, and proud he finally learned to text his grandkids. Gus couldn't install a camera if you spotted him the screwdriver in the instructions. There was the propane fellow who topped off my tank, a kid I'd never met, no reason on earth to spy on some old man's checkbook. And there was my daughter and the husband she'd brought home 11 years ago. The 2 of them had come up the Sunday before, said they wanted to help around the place before the snow. My son-in-law spent the better part of an hour checking the detectors and the carbon monoxide alarms, and I remember thinking what a decent thing that was for a man to worry about, since CO is exactly the kind of quiet killer I spent my life keeping out of people's houses. My daughter had sat at that kitchen table the whole time asking me questions, easy questions. How was I sleeping? Was I remembering to take the blood pressure pills? Did I ever get turned around driving into town anymore? I thought she was just being sweet. Now I sat there with my tea going cold, and I felt something I'm not ashamed to call dread, because the lens was pointed at where I do my money. And my daughter had spent an hour asking me whether my own mind was slipping. I'm an engineer at heart, even if my hands smell like solder, and the first rule is you don't act on a hunch. You test it, you apply pressure, and you watch what cracks. So I decided I'd give them nothing, and I'd see who came knocking. I left the camera up. I went about my week loud and ordinary, talking to myself a little more than usual, the way a man living alone does. Except now I was talking for an audience, and I waited. It didn't take long. Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang, and it was my daughter, and her voice had that bright, brittle quality, the kind people get when they're reading off a script in their own head. She asked how I was doing. Then, before I'd half answered, she asked whether I'd had any more of those confused spells. I told her I didn't know what she meant. She said, "Oh, you know, Dad, like at Thanksgiving when you forgot the name of the gravy boat. I had not forgotten the name of anything. I'd made a joke about the ugly gravy boat her aunt gave us in 1986, and apparently somewhere along the line that joke had become evidence. I told her I felt fine. There was a pause, and in that pause, I heard her husband's voice low in the background, and then she said, "Well, we just worry about you all alone up there, and we think it might be time to talk about getting some things in order. Some paperwork to make life easier. Paperwork to make life easier. I've buried a wife, and I've signed the papers that come with that, and I'll tell you, nobody who actually loves you talks about your life as paperwork to be put in order while you're standing on two good legs." I said we'd talk about it sometime. I hung up and I sat very still. That night I couldn't sleep, and I got to thinking about the tablet. About 4 months back, my daughter had shown up with one of those tablets, all wrapped up like a birthday thing, said it would help me video call the grandkids. Her husband set it up himself. Sat in my recliner for the better part of an evening, syncing this and signing into that, telling me not to touch any of the settings or I'd break the connection. I'd thought that was a little controlling. Now I went and got the tablet out of the drawer where it had been collecting dust, and I powered it up, and I did the one thing I knew how to do, which was look at what programs were running. There was one I didn't recognize. Some remote access thing, the kind a help desk uses to take over your screen from across the country. My stomach turned over slow. I didn't poke at it. If somebody was watching that screen, the worst thing I could do was let them see me find it. I shut it back down, set it exactly where it had been, lens down and innocent, and I went to the only computer in the house I was sure nobody had touched. Gus's old desktop, 2 doors up, where I drove at 6 the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a bad feeling. Gus let me in his robe and didn't ask a single question, which is the mark of a good neighbor and a better friend. I sat at his kitchen counter and I started typing. That remote program, turns out it can give a person on the other end your whole screen, your banking, your email, your passwords as you type them. I looked up how long it had been on my tablet, and it lined up to the week they gave it to me. 4 months. 4 months of somebody somewhere watching every dollar I moved. I sat back, and I'll tell you my hands weren't steady. But the camera and the spying, ugly as they were, weren't the thing that finally made me cold all the way through. That came when I called my attorney. His name's Howard Pruitt, an honest man who handled Ruth's estate and didn't pad his hours doing it. I drove down to his office in town that Thursday with a thumb drive full of photographs. The camera, the tablet screen, the remote program, all of it. Howard's a careful reader. He went through every picture without a word, and the longer he looked, the harder his jaw set. Then I asked him the question that had been sitting on my chest since Tuesday. I asked him to check whether anybody had filed a power of attorney in my name. He didn't answer right off. He turned to his keyboard and pulled up the state records and the county filings, and he typed for what felt like a long time. And then he took his glasses off and he looked at me the way you look at a man before you tell him bad news. 2 weeks back, somebody had submitted a durable power of attorney bearing my signature, naming my son-in-law as my agent. Full authority, finances, property, medical decisions, the whole works. It hadn't gone through, and the only reason it hadn't was that the notary who'd processed it got a bad feeling about the ID that was used and flagged it for review. Howard had tried to reach me about it, but I'd been up at my cousin's camp on Sebago with no cell service for 5 days, and by the time I was back I'd never checked my messages, because who checks their messages when nothing's wrong? He turned the screen toward me so I could see the signature, and I want you to know I've signed my own name maybe 400,000 times in my life, and I stared at that thing and I could not have sworn it wasn't mine. It was that good. Whoever made it had a real one to copy from, which the remote program would have handed them. Any scanned check, any signed PDF in my email. Howard said, "Glenn, sit down." I was already sitting. He said, "This is the part you need to hear. There's more." 5 days earlier, someone had applied to take a home equity line of credit against my house, my paid-off house, $190,000, with the property put up as collateral. The title company had caught a discrepancy and frozen it pending verification, which is the only mercy in this whole story, and they'd called Howard because his name was on the deed work. $190,000 against the only thing Ruth and I ever managed to fully own. I asked him who in their right mind lends that kind of money on a forged application, and Howard said the lender was an outfit called Stonebridge Financial Group, and the way he said it told me everything. He said it wasn't a bank. It was the kind of operation that dresses up like an investment firm and lends fast and ugly to people the banks have already turned away at interest that would make a loan shark blush, and they don't send a polite letter when you fall behind. He said, Glenn, if that power of attorney had gone through first, all of this would have been perfectly legal. Your daughter's husband would have had every right to mortgage your house out from under you, and you'd have had no standing to stop it. I drove home that afternoon checking my mirrors like a man being followed, because for the first time I understood I might be. Now here's where a younger man, or an angrier one, would have gone straight to confront them, and that would have been a mistake. I needed to know how deep it ran first. There was a name in my old address book I hadn't dialed in 15 years. Dale, a retired detective Ruth and I had known back when our girl was in grade school, the kind of fellow who could find out what a man had for breakfast on a Tuesday in March of 2009. I called him at 2 in the morning because by then I wasn't sleeping at all, and he answered rough and ready to chew me out until I said my name. And then he went quiet and said, "What's wrong, Glenn?" I told him I needed to know everything about my son-in-law, his money, who he owed, what he'd been doing, by morning if he could manage it. Dale called me back at 6. He told me to sit down, and I told him I was getting real tired of people telling me to sit down, and he laughed a little, but it wasn't a real laugh. My son-in-law was drowning. He'd run a contracting business into the ground 3 years back, then tried to dig out the way desperate men do, sports betting first, those phone apps that'll take your last dime at 2 in the morning, then some crypto scheme a buddy talked him into. He'd lost it all, and then he'd lost money he didn't have, and he'd borrowed from Stonebridge to cover the hole. And Stonebridge, Dale told me, was sitting in the middle of a federal investigation, a money laundering front. The kind of people who, when a debt comes due and there's no cash, take whatever's worth taking and remove whatever's in the way. The way Dale said remove whatever's in the way, careful and flat, I understood he meant me. He told me my son-in-law owed them close to $200,000 and that they'd given him until the end of the month and that the end of the month was 11 days out. He told me one more thing, the thing I keep coming back to, even now. He said, Glenn, somebody drove past your place twice this week in a car that doesn't belong to anybody around here. Slowed down, sat at the end of your road. Your collateral's being appraised, old buddy, and you're standing on it. I asked him what he thought I should do, and Dale, who has seen the worst of people for a living, said 3 things. Call the FBI field office, because Stonebridge was their case. Call the state police, because the forgery and the elder exploitation were a crime right now. And think hard about whether I wanted to hand my own daughter to either of them. That last one, that's the one that broke something in me. Because here's the thing, the camera and the loan and the forged signature couldn't quite make me believe, even with the proof in my hand. My son-in-law, sure. I never warmed to him, and a man who put a lens on his father-in-law's checkbook was capable of anything. But my daughter, my girl. I taught her to ride a bike in the church parking lot. I sat up with her the night her mother died, and she cried into my shirt until the sun came up. I could not make the math come out where she was in on it. So I had to find out. And there's only one honest way to find out what's in a person's heart, and that's to give them room to say it. I didn't sleep that night either, but I stopped trying to. I sat at the kitchen table, out of the camera's view. I'd learned its angle by then, and I made a plan the way I used to lay out a job, every step in order. Friday morning, I drove the hour down to the big box store 2 towns over, far enough that nobody would recognize me, and I paid cash for 4 little cameras, the kind that record to a card right inside them with no internet, no cloud, nothing anybody could reach into and erase. I bought a cheap laptop, opened it fresh, never touched the network. Back home, I spent the better part of the afternoon hiding those cameras the way I used to hide condensate lines, so a job looked clean. One behind the books on the shelf roof filled. One in the old mantel clock that hasn't kept time since the Clinton administration. One in the birdhouse my granddaughter painted, angled in through the window at the front room. One behind Ruth's photograph on my desk, so she could watch over this last thing, too. All 4 feeding to that clean laptop, and not one of them to the tablet I now knew was poison. Then I made my phone calls. First to Howard, to ask the one thing I had to be sure of. I said, if I get them on a recording admitting it here in my own house, does it count? He said, New Hampshire's a one-party consent state, Glenn. You can record any conversation you're a part of. He said, but you need 3 things out of their mouths: that they put the devices there, that they forged the documents, and that they meant to take what's yours. You get those 3, he said, and it's fraud and exploitation and conspiracy, plain as day. I wrote those 3 down in pencil, and my hand shook doing it. Then I called the FBI office in Boston, and I told a young agent named Reyes that I had documentary evidence tying a forged loan to Stonebridge Financial Group, and the line went very attentive very fast. Then I called Adult Protective Services, because Dale had told me that elder exploitation is their fight as much as anybody's, and a woman named Ms. Tran listened to my whole account without once treating me like a confused old man, which after the week I'd had was its own small kindness. I told them all the same thing. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, my house. I'd have them on tape, and I'd need somebody here when it happened because, whatever else was true, these were still my children walking through that door, and I wasn't going to be alone with what came next. Reyes asked if I'd come into the office instead. I said no. I said, you can be at my kitchen by 9 on Saturday, or you can come up Sunday and figure out why the house is so quiet. There was a silence, and then she said they'd have 2 people there, out of sight, and that if it went sideways, I was to get on the floor and let them work. I said it wouldn't go sideways. I said, he's a coward, and she's my daughter, and neither one of those is a person who shoots. I called my daughter last at 6 that evening. I kept it short. I said, come up tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Just you. We need to talk about the paperwork. She said, of course, Dad, that's wonderful. We've been hoping you'd be ready. We. I heard the we, and I knew her husband would be coming whether I asked for him or not, and that was fine. I wanted them both in the frame. I didn't sleep. I sat up watching 4 little gray pictures of my own house glowing on a laptop, and somewhere around 3 I let myself cry. Not loud, just the leaking kind, because I already knew that no matter how the morning went, I was going to lose my daughter either way. The only question left was whether I'd lose her to a prison or to a grave, and that's a thing no father should have to choose between, and I chose, and I'd choose it again. They came at 5 of 9. I heard the tires on the gravel before I saw them, and I checked the laptop one last time, and there they were in the kitchen camera's corner, a man and a woman from the state, tucked into the pantry off the kitchen, where you couldn't see them from the front room, still as fence posts. Ms. Tran was in the mudroom. I steadied myself on the back of Ruth's chair, and I went to open the door. My daughter hugged me. That's the part I'll carry. She put her arms around my neck and told me she loved me and that everything was going to be easier now. And over her shoulder, her husband wouldn't meet my eyes, just nodded at the floor and shook my hand with a hand that was cold and a little damp. I sat them on the couch. I took Ruth's chair across from them. I asked if they wanted coffee, and they said no. And my son-in-law said, "So, you've thought about it. The power of attorney, getting things organized," and I let that hang in the air a second before I answered. I said I found a camera in my smoke detector. I have never in my life seen the blood go out of two faces at once like that. My daughter's hand found her husband's knee. He started to say, "Dad, that's not." And I held up my phone and I said, "It's pointed at where I pay my bills." And then I said the number, 190,000, and I watched it land like a slap. My son-in-law tried to stand, and I told him to sit down, and something in my voice put him back on the cushion. I laid it out flat, no anger, just the facts, the way I'd write up a furnace that failed inspection. The remote program on the tablet. The forged power of attorney that the notary caught, the line of credit against the house, Stonebridge, the 2 weeks they'd given him, the 11 days that were now down to 10. And here is the moment I'd been dreading and praying for both. I looked at my daughter, my girl, the bike in the parking lot, the night her mother died, and I asked her one question. I said, "Did you know?" She didn't say no. She looked at her hands and her chin trembled, and she said, "Dad, you don't understand. They were going to hurt him. They came to the house. They scared the kids." And I said, "So you decided to take mine." And she started to cry, and through it she said the thing that I think I'll hear in the quiet for the rest of my life. She said, "You've got the house and the pension, and you're alone up here, and you don't even need it. And we were drowning, and we figured by the time you'd... She stopped. But I'd been a father a long time, and I could finish it. By the time I was gone. Her husband grabbed her arm and hissed at her to shut up, and that was the moment I knew which of them had drawn it up and which of them had gone along. He'd been the one with the apps and the debt and the cold sweat, but she'd been the one who sat at my table asking whether I was losing my mind so they'd have a paper trail to call me incompetent. And she'd done it with my own hands, warm in hers, and I don't know which is worse, the one who plans the thing or the one who can plan it against her own father. I asked him plain, "Did you put the cameras up?" He said, "Yes, barely." "Did you put the program on the tablet?" "Yes." "Did you sign my name on those papers?" He looked at my daughter and then he said, "She did the signature. I knew about it." And my daughter said, "Do the crying. It was supposed to be temporary. We were going to pay it all back. You were never even going to know." And her husband shouted at her to stop talking. And I said, "Quiet, both of you." And the room went still, and I stood up. I said, "I think that's enough." And the 2 people from the state came out of my pantry with their credentials up, and a third came in from the mudroom, and my son-in-law made a sound I'd only ever heard from a trapped animal. My daughter's head came up off her hands, and she looked at me, and her face. I won't describe her face. Some things a man keeps. They read them their rights right there on Ruth's couch. My son-in-law didn't resist. My daughter said my name once, just Dad, like a question, like she still couldn't believe I'd done it. And I had to turn and look out the window at the mountains because I could not watch them put the cuffs on her. When the cars pulled out of my gravel, I stood in the middle of my own kitchen, and the quiet came down like a roof falling in. I'd won. That's what they tell you it is. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like I'd reached into my own chest and taken something out that wasn't going back. The case took the better part of a year. The FBI hit Stonebridge that spring. More than a dozen arrests, my son-in-law's debt the least of what they were into. His testimony, once his lawyer made him see sense, helped them, and I suppose there's a mercy in that somewhere. At sentencing, he got the heavier hand, and I was glad of it, because he was the engine of the thing. 8 years, federal for the wire fraud and the conspiracy and what they call the attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, though I'll tell you to my face, I was never vulnerable, just trusting, which is a different sickness. My daughter's lawyer fought it, said she'd been coerced, said she was a mother protecting her family, but the recording had her own voice on it, planning, and the jury didn't buy the coercion, not from the woman who'd sat at her father's table taking notes on his memory. She got 4 years and a fine she'll be paying off long after she's out. When they led her away the last day, she didn't scream at me the way you'd think. She just looked back once, and there was nothing in it I could hold on to, and the door closed, and that was that. I had Howard lock the house and the land and what little I'd saved into an irrevocable trust, the kind nobody can borrow against or sign away, not even me in a weak moment, not even somebody with my own signature in their pocket. If you're listening to an old man tell this, and you've got a paid-off home and grown kids who started talking about your paperwork, go do that this week. Don't wait the way I waited. It's been a while now. I got a dog last fall, a brown mutt the shelter said was part shepherd and part question mark, and I named her Pepper, and she sleeps at the foot of the bed and barks at the propane truck and has done more for me than any pill the doctor offers. Gus comes by Wednesdays and Sundays. The nightmares mostly quit. I don't check the smoke detectors but the once a year anymore, and when I do it myself. I started going to a group down at the senior center, folks my age who got taken or nearly taken by the people they raised, and Lord, there are more of us than you'd ever guess. I get up sometimes and tell my story. The camera and the lone and the morning on the couch, and afterward people come up and tell me theirs in a whisper, like it's a shameful thing, like it was their fault for loving somebody. It never was. I tell them that. It helps me to say it as much as it helps them to hear it. A couple months back my phone rang, a number I didn't know, and a man's voice, older, shaking. Said his name was Gordon from over in Vermont, said he'd found me through the Elder Abuse Forum online. Said he'd found a strange little device tucked into the cable box his son set up. Said his son had started asking him lately whether he ought to be driving anymore, whether he was managing all right with the bills. Said his daughter-in-law had brought him a tablet for the grandkids. I closed my eyes and I knew the whole shape of it before he finished. I told him, Gordon, don't panic and don't you touch a thing. I told him to photograph everything and leave it where it sat. I told him to find an honest lawyer and check the county records for any paper with his name on it he didn't sign. I told him to find a computer his son had never been near. He asked me why I'd help a stranger, and I looked out at the mountains Ruth picked, with Pepper's chin warm on my foot, and I told him the truth. I told him a year ago I was right where he was sitting, and that the only thing I'd do different is I'd have believed my own gut sooner. I told him trusting your children isn't a virtue when they've stopped earning it, and that protecting what's yours isn't selfish. It's just staying alive long enough to find out what your life can still be. We talked a good while. I gave him Howard's number. When I hung up, I sat there a long time, and it didn't feel empty the way it used to. It felt like the one good thing I could make out of the worst thing that ever happened to me. People ask if I'd take it back, if I could go back to that morning on the ladder and just leave the cover on the detector and never know, and I tell them no, and I mean it, because the not knowing was its own kind of dying slow and blind, with my own hand signing my life away in a room where I wasn't even present. I'd rather have the truth, even this truth, even the empty couch and the daughter who looks at me from the other side of a glass twice a year and has nothing left to say. They tell you blood is thicker than water. Maybe. But I learned the hard way that a man's first duty is to the life he's still got, and there is no shame in fighting to keep it, not even from your own. So I'll be here, on Ruth's land, with Ruth's dog and Ruth's chair and the mountain she loved, getting older the slow, honest way, alive on purpose, which is more than they meant to leave me. And when the propane truck comes up the road and Pepper goes to barking at the window, I get up out of my chair every single time and I check who it is myself. The camera didn't ruin my family. It only showed me a thing that was already broken and had been breaking quietly for years, while I called it love. That's the part I had to sit with. My daughter didn't wake up one morning and decide to take my house. She got there one small surrender at a time, a debt covered, a lie told to smooth it over, a father reduced in her mind from a man into an asset she'd inherit anyway. Every choice she didn't correct made the next one easier, until sitting at my table taking notes on whether I was losing my mind felt to her like nothing at all. Cause and effect doesn't care how much you love somebody. What you feed grows, and what you excuse comes back to your door. I think about why I'm still here on Ruth's land with Pepper at my feet, and it comes down to three things that have nothing to do with luck. The first is that I wouldn't let myself do the easy wrong. When I found that lens, I wanted to rip it down and scream, and instead I chose to do the thing that was right and slow and provable, because a man's word and his evidence are worth more than his temper. The second is that I made myself think before I moved. 40 years of furnaces taught me you don't guess at a leak, you find it. So I tested instead of accused, I gathered instead of reacted, and that patience is the only reason Howard caught the forged papers and Dale traced the money before it was too late. And the third is that I simply did not quit. There were nights I cried into the dark and wanted to leave the cover on that detector and never know. Pushing through that, calling Dale at 2 in the morning, driving an hour to buy cameras with my hands shaking. That took a kind of stubbornness I didn't know I still had. If you take one thing from an old man, take that. Do the honest thing even when the angry thing feels better. Slow down and look at what's true before you decide what it means. And when your knees and your heart both tell you to stop, keep going one more step. Those aren't gifts you're born with. They're muscles, and mine only got strong because life made me use them. My daughter is behind glass now, and Gordon over in Vermont is fighting the same fight I fought. And I'm out here on my porch with a dog who isn't blood but never once lied to me. I lost the family I thought I had, but I kept myself clear-eyed, upright, and still standing. And at 67, I've learned that's the one thing nobody can forge a signature to take.